Should SEO, search engine optimization, be a major focus for you when you're launching your no-code app? We get a ton of questions about this, and it makes sense because you can launch your no-code app, but if you have no users, then you're not going to get very far. And SEO is one of those things that's talked about constantly, and it's assumed that you have to have certain SEO factors involved in your app in order to grow. So today we're going to talk about whether SEO should be a major focus in the beginning, how much you should be looking into it, the things you can start doing now, other things you could do besides SEO to start building up your user base, and when it might make sense to focus even more on SEO. So we're going to cover a lot. And if you've ever had this question before, stick around until the end because all of this is important to hear. Now, first, if you're new around here, my name is Kristen, and I'm the co-founder of Coaching No Code Apps, where we help non-technical entrepreneurs build custom apps so they can launch their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses all without coding. So the first thing to clarify is SEO versus ASO. So SEO stands for Search Engine Optimization. ASO stands for App Store Optimization. So if you're building a web application, and if you're using Bubble, then you are building a web application at least first, then you'd be thinking about SEO, search engine optimization. In other words, if someone goes onto Google, for example, and types in a search query, your app, your landing page would be the one that you would want to show up if it's relevant. With App Store optimization, this is a little bit different. If you check out a quick blog post about this, like the one I have pulled up here, you'll see App Store optimization looks at things like app name and title, keywords, description, subtitle, total number of downloads, ratings and reviews in the app store. So if you're building a native app or a hybrid app where you're taking a web application and then later turning it into a hybrid app, so a web app with native-like features, then these are things that you would look at when you're putting your app into the app store. So if you're building a web app right now, this is what you're going to be thinking about and even putting into place within your app. Okay, so here's the deal. There's no right or wrong answer as to whether SEO is something you have to be using. If you are wanting your app or your landing pages to show up in search results, then you're going to want to do some SEO work or some optimizing of your app. But how important is it for you? Well, the reality is SEO is very much a long game. And so the question to be asking is not necessarily whether or not you should be thinking about SEO, but more so when and how you should be thinking about it throughout your app's initial launches and ultimate life cycle. For example, if you do a quick search on Google for something like, how long does SEO take to work? This is what came up. Many SEO firms will tell you that it takes 4 to 6 months to start seeing results, and that's generally accurate. And SEO results can grow over time. And this is the type of thing you'll see repeated throughout different blogs, interviews, or even if you talk to an SEO agency, they're going to tell you that SEO takes a long time to have an effect. So that doesn't mean you shouldn't be thinking about SEO or putting SEO factors into place within your app. You just need to understand that SEO is not an overnight tactic. It's not going to be something that if you sit down for the next week and focus on SEO, the following week you're going to reap the benefits. It just doesn't work that way. So the real question is, again, when should you be focusing on SEO and how? And that's what we're going to go through now over here on the whiteboard. So what I want you to do is think about your app from the initial pilot launch all the way through to the expansion of your app. So we're going to draw this out, and this line right here is going to be that time frame or cycle. So if we look at right here as this point in time being your pilot launch, so you're launching the very first basic version of your app. If that is your pilot launch, then we can look at this point here as your rollout. So essentially what would be happening is after you pilot launch, you're going to be taking feedback, taking pilot users, beta users through your app, and you're going to be iterating on it. So you're going to be changing the features that you have, potentially removing them. Again, just taking the feedback and implementing it into your app. So that takes you from your pilot stage to your rollout stage. And the reason we're talking about this is because at these different stages, you can be thinking about SEO at different times. So we'll come back to SEO. But after your rollout, this is where you start to expand the app. So with your pilot launch, again, you're taking those initial pilot or beta users through your app. You're getting that initial feedback, the validation of your product itself. You're learning how it can be implemented at scale. Once you make those initial iterations based on that initial feedback, then you roll the app out on a larger scale. You'll start to market the app more heavily, spread the word, bring on more users, start charging, potentially start charging more if you've already been charging. So after that, you're looking at expanding and still, of course, iterating. And that'll happen for the lifetime of your app. Okay, so the reason why I want to go through this is because the way you look or think about SEO at your pilot stage is different than how you'll think about SEO at your rollout stage. And that's also different than how you'll think about SEO as you continue to expand and iterate your app thereafter. Ultimately, if you're thinking about SEO, then you are thinking about user generation. You want to bring more people to your app. You want to convert more users and grow your user base. Now, when you launch your pilot app, you want to be growing your user base immediately. So the way we like to look at this as when you do your pilot launch, you want to be going after your lowest hanging fruit prospective users. So if you think about SEO as being a long game, so potentially taking 4 to 6 months, even longer in some cases, then obviously it's not immediate. If you put SEO tweaks into place, if you do on-page or off-page SEO, which we'll talk about, it's going to take a while. And so there's nothing immediate about that. But you don't want to launch your app, focus heavily or even solely on SEO, and then have to wait 4 to 6 months or longer to start seeing users coming on board your app, because chances are if you do that, your app is just going to fizzle out in the meantime, because you need to get those users coming on quickly so that you can start charging and building up a revenue early on. SEO can come into play, but you have to go after the lowest hanging fruit first in order to build up the initial user base in the first place. So with that in mind, I want to talk about what your user outreach and acquisition can look like at the pilot stage, the rollout stage, and thereafter, and where and how SEO fits into that. If you think about wanting to go after the lowest hanging fruit in order to get the most immediate results, so in order to get users onto your app as quickly as possible when you do your pilot launch, lowest hanging fruit things look like, or lowest hanging fruit acquisition channels look like immediate contacts. So people who you already know and who you have access to, this is always where you should look at the very beginning. If you have contacts, and if you're building an app, then you should have contacts within the industry that that app is for, because you should have some knowledge over the problems, the processes that will be going into your app, or the problems your app will be solving in the solution. So you should have knowledge. That means you should have immediate contacts who you can reach out to. That's the lowest hanging fruit there is, because you can just talk to these people and bring them onto your app. There's really not a ton of effort involved in that other than having conversations. And you should be having conversations always throughout the lifetime of your business. So best to start now. So that's a really low hanging fruit acquisition channel in your pilot launch that you can go after, and you should. You can also look at groups. So if you are potentially looking at social groups, Facebook, LinkedIn groups, things like that, if you have access to your target market and your prospective users within those, and you can already dip into those pools of your prospective users, then that can be a really, really low-hanging fruit way to get some immediate users coming into your app. You can also look at potentially your own company. So if you are working for a company, that would be your prospective user. Maybe you're building a tool. that handles a process that you manage in your day-to-day job, right? Your own company can be the lowest hanging fruit there is. And we've seen entrepreneurs and even some of our own clients do this. So this is low hanging fruit. This is what's going to get you the most immediate, quick traction when you launch your pilot app. Okay, now we'll come back to how SEO plays into that, but notice that SEO is not one of those low-hanging fruit acquisition channels or think factors that you should be focusing on in those early stages. So the way you want to look at this is when you have those conversations with your immediate contacts or with management in your company, your colleagues, your coworkers, whoever it may be, when you have conversations with your prospective users who might be spending time in groups that you're a part of, the key words here are having conversations. And when you have those conversations, you're going to learn a lot. So if you think about launching a pilot app with the goal being to intake feedback and iterate on that, well, you should also be intaking feedback and iterating on your messaging. So those conversations that you're having. Okay, so after you have those initial contacts, you make those initial contacts, you have those initial conversations, and you see what works and what doesn't in terms of the types of conversations you have, the things that you say, the ways you try to convert people. That is going to allow you to learn and iterate on your messaging. Okay, so this is where your initial messaging, so what will be your marketing, right? This is where it really starts to form. It starts to take shape and mold into something that you can make more repetitive because now you've seen what works and what doesn't. So that takes us now to the rollout stage. So when you get to the rollout stage with your app, again, this is where you are launching more widely, bringing on more users. Potentially you're starting to charge here or charging more. What you really want to do is take what you've learned over here with your messaging, and you want to make it more scalable, because while these over here are those low-hanging fruit outlets that you can look to build immediate traction with your user base, it's not scalable, because if you're growing your app to many, many users potentially, then you can't be having in-depth one-on-one conversations with all of them. It just doesn't work, right? And so you have to take what you've learned and make it more scalable. So when you move into your rollout phase, that can look differently in how you channel it into another acquisition method. So for example, you could take what you've learned and start running ads. Now, you could start running ads over here too, but remember, in that early stage, you haven't yet tested your messaging. So that means if you want to use ads as your first acquisition channel, then you're going to have to be spending money for research and development, which is fine, but a lot of people don't want to do that or can't do that before they even have any users on board their app. And so this is the non-scalable but cheap way to do your initial user acquisition. And then once you have learned what works, you can funnel that in to running ads with messaging that, again, now you know works, and that is a lot more scalable. Okay. You can also do a lot of the same things that you did with your initial lower hanging fruit outreach, but you can automate it. Okay, so you can pull that messaging into landing pages, email campaigns, things like that, opt-ins, lead magnets. I mean, there's tons of ways you can go about it, but you can take your messaging and you can make it more automated, or you can make it more one-to-many instead of one-to-one. For example, the things that we talk about in these YouTube videos, we learned what is helpful by having many, many, many conversations. And while those conversations were one-on-one, we can take that and we can create a video and then turn that conversation into one-to-many. And so many people can hear the same thing. So you're just taking what you've learned and you're making it more scalable. You can also, of course, hire someone to help you with that. So maybe you do want to stick with some of these lesser scalable things to keep building that immediate traction. Well, you can hire someone to help you with that. Okay, so there are other ways to go about it, but I just want to give you an idea of what the user acquisition can look like at these different stages. Now the question is, when does SEO come into play and how does it come into play? Well, if you move past the rollout stage, this is where now you're looking at your messaging a little bit differently. So you're still learning, right? You're going to be learning from running ads, from automating things. However you go about it, you're always going to be learning. That means that you're still going to be iterating, but you're also likely going to be adding other channels on to supplement the ones that you've already started. So other user acquisition channels. The way this often works is you build up an organic acquisition channel and you build up a paid acquisition channel so that the two can supplement each other. Because if you're always relying on one channel, then if anything changes with that channel, you're going to be scrambling to make a lot of alterations on your end to make up for it. So if you have channels that complement each other, where if one starts to struggle, the other can still be bringing in leads or prospective users, then you're going to have a much more sustainable business over the long run. So that can look like running ads, like we already talked about, and it can look like focusing on SEO or just organic traffic altogether. It can also include those original channels that you've already set up. So notice that you're not focusing on a bunch of channels really early on. You are staying hyper-focused early on because the first thing you have to do is find what works. Once you find what works, then you can automate it. And once you've automated it, meaning you've taken a lot of the manual work and the time really off of your hands, then you can focus on adding other channels and you can do so a lot more successfully. And then ultimately these channels can start to become all of them more automated and more scalable. So that's kind of how you can think of the evolution of user acquisition. Obviously, we're looking at this from a high level. There's a million different tactics and strategies that you can put into play, but just in understanding how this can evolve, this is how you can be thinking about it. Here's the thing though, if SEO is not really becoming a more heavy focus until this later stage here, then when does it start? Right? Because if SEO is a long game and it can take 4 to 6 months to even take effect, or the steps you take to work on SEO, if those won't have an effect for 4 to 6 months, then do you wait to even start until there, or do you start earlier? Okay, so this is what I like to do, and this is what I would suggest is, when you're starting out with your app, focus on the baseline SEO practices, and you'll see a theme here. This is like the low-hanging fruit SEO. Okay, so if we're looking to build immediate traction with our app, then we need to be looking at how can we get users on really quickly. And in order to do that, you need to make sure that your focus isn't being spread too thinly in other areas. But if ultimately you do want SEO to be a factor in your user generation right down here, then if you put a baseline level of SEO into place early on, it's not going to take much of your time, but it is going to, again, set that baseline so that once you start focusing on it more heavily, it's already there. So I like to look at this baseline SEO as simply best practices. And there are some really simple things you can do in your app that we'll talk about. But these are really just the things that you can put into your app, and you can kind of think about it in the same way as app organization. We just posted another video on making sure things are documented in your app, organizing the back end of your app so that you can prepare later on to bring other developers on or to potentially hand the app off to a different developer. And that'll set you up for success at that time. So you do those baseline best practices to make sure that you're not scrambling later on. Well, it's the same thing here, right? These are baseline SEO practices that are really easy to do. They can just become a part of your development process, and that will set you up later on when you come into these stages and you do start to make those changes. Let's dip into some of those baseline SEO practices. So the first two things you want to think about are on-page and off-page SEO. So on-page SEO are the things that you are doing within your app or your website to influence how your app shows up in search results. And off-page SEO are the things that you can do outside of your app to make that same influence. So on-page SEO, we'll jump into the bubble editor here in just a second and go through some of the really low-hanging fruit things that you can do. For off-page SEO, that can be getting backlinks to your app. So for example, if you were to write a guest blog post on a relevant website, relevant to your app, and it points back to your landing page, then that's going to be an indicator to Google or other search engines as to what your app or your site, your landing page is about, and it'll give it a little bit of a boost in authority. Now, keep in mind, we help people build app-based businesses, so we're certainly not an SEO agency. So do your own research on the things that you're going to be implementing, but this is what we've learned from our own experience in working with SEO. So just keep that in mind. But the things that we're going to go over are really those best practices, those low-hanging fruit things that you can go ahead and start doing now. So I have a sandbox bubble editor open on my screen here. Now, if you're using a different no-code app development platform, obviously this is going to look different, and you may not have the same settings. You may have more, you may have less, but these are things you can still at least look for. So if you go to your settings tab and you go to SEO and meta tags, you're going to see sections where you can include things that might influence SEO. Now you can see here that this sandbox app is not on a paid plan, and some of the SEO settings are only available on paid plans. So if you see this in your editor, then that's why. But you can add in a site title, site name, a description. These are the things where when you do a Google search, this is what shows up. So if your app or your index page, for example, is going to show up in search results, these are the things that the searcher would be seeing. And so these are the things that could ultimately entice that person who is searching to click on your app. You can also come in here and do things like expose the type of tags for text elements so that you can create hierarchies on your pages with headlines and subheadlines and body text. You can do things like expose a sitemap file, which can help you when you go into Google Search Console, which will help you better manage your SEO. You can request for your pages to be indexed so that Google can crawl them and show them in search results. You can also work with on-page SEO within your property editor. So you can see there is a section for a page title. You can scroll down and add descriptions, which would again show up as the individual page descriptions in search results. So if you go and you do a quick Google search for anything you want, the site name and then the description below it, that's what we'd be looking at here. If you're on a paid plan and you enable some of those other SEO settings, then you'll see those in here as well. Like I talked about, the creating hierarchy with HTML tags in your text. You can also work with on-page SEO when it comes to images. Now, one of the things a lot of people ask about is creating a blog, because blogs are known to be great for SEO. Now, blogs are really a whole other topic, so we won't go into that in this video. But what I will say is that, remember, we're laying those baseline SEO elements. So we're looking at SEO best practices, things that you can do or things that you can build into your development process. And you can do that within your app's editor. You can do that with the on-page SEO without having a blog. So we can dive deeper into the blog topic potentially in another video if that would be helpful. But I would not qualify a blog as a low-hanging fruit SEO baseline practice, because you can and should get users without having to have a blog. So you should get those users first, because a blog, and I say this and I'm making some generalizations, but a blog is probably going to take away a lot of your focus, because it does take time to get that up and running. Even if you're hiring out for someone else to write a blog, it takes time. And that time in the really early stages is going to serve you a lot better and give you a higher ROI if you use it to get more users. So I'll take us back to our whiteboard and our drawing here so that we can go through it one more time. So remember that when you're looking at SEO, instead of asking, should you do it, you should ask when and how you should do it. And you want to break your app down into some different phases. So we have the pilot phase or stage, we have our rollout stage, and then expanding thereafter. So when you launch your pilot, the goal is to learn and iterate. When you go into your rollout, you aim to expand and iterate. So when we couple that with user acquisition, which if you're thinking about SEO, then that's the goal, more user acquisition, then in your pilot stage, we want to be going after the lowest hanging fruit so that you can start to iterate. Because without users on board quickly, you can't get feedback and you can't iterate, which means you can't roll out. So focus everything you have on getting those users and getting the feedback so that you can roll out. If this right here should happen in, let's say, 3 months, well, doing any SEO work is not even going to have any type of effect, likely, during that time, right? So the low-hanging fruit user acquisition methods would be reaching out to your immediate contacts, dipping into groups that you already have access to, potentially having conversations with your own company, your management, your colleagues, your coworkers, things like that. Having conversations, because while you're launching your pilot app to test how your product will work and be applicable at scale, you are also launching your pilot app to see what messaging will work and be applicable at scale. So once you learn and you iterate on that, then you can create more scalable outreach. And that can include things like ads or doing the same things over here, but automating them, or potentially hiring someone to help you do these things. That's automated. Okay, and that's going to let you learn, iterate, and then add on. Because once you have outreach that is working, in other words, it's generating users for you, and it's mostly or at least partly automated, then you can start to spread your focus to other things. And that's where we look at coupling potentially paid acquisition with organic acquisition. So things like SEO in combination with some of your original channels or different channels if those didn't work and you changed, and on and on. Okay, so if you look at it that way, then in the beginning, when we're going after the low-hanging fruit, then look at SEO as a baseline best practice. What can you do that's not going to take your focus away from getting the immediate users and getting the immediate feedback? What can you do at this point that will set you up to be able to add on at that point? And you can see that's a trend in every single phase with your app, right? You're doing something that is less scalable, or you're starting with the baseline so that you can then add on and scale up afterwards, after you have found what works, because there's no reason to try and scale and automate something before you know whether it works. You're likely just going to be wasting your time. All right, I hope this helps answer a lot of your questions about SEO. If you're looking to launch a pilot app right now, this is something that you're probably going to be thinking a lot about if you haven't asked the question already. And if you're launching a pilot app, remember there are phases, specific phases that you want to go through, and you want to move through them as quickly and efficiently as possible. And so if you're at the point where you're just starting out with your app, you haven't launched yet, or maybe you're still in those planning phases, we have a template, a training that will help you make sure you're launching the right pilot app. So you're launching the right things at the right time so that you can get those immediate users giving you the right type of feedback. Because remember, once you get that, that's when you can start to scale up. And that's when SEO can actually start to benefit you. So if you want to grab that free training, it's over at coachingnocodeapps.com/perfect-pilot. So perfect-pilot. Grab that, go ahead and lay the groundwork for building your pilot app so that, again, you can get that feedback from those immediate users and actually start to scale up and look at other tactics and strategies like SEO that could help you grow long term. So head to coachingnocodeapps.com/perfect-pilot. We hope to see you there. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.